Welcome. My name is Anujeet Sareen. I'm a portfolio manager. I work for an investment firm called Brandywine Global in Philadelphia. And I have the privilege this evening of moderating this discussion between our two distinguished speakers. Before I introduce them both, let me just say a few words about what this event is about. The title of the New York encounter and the title of this event, I think, speak to a deep unease we have about our country. There is this sense that we are more divided today, we're more fractious, we're more partisan than we have been in our history. And there's actually data that supports this. It is the case that we are more divided today than we have been in the past. One of the most sobering statistics on this is how polarized our politics have become. Our politics have been this polarized since just before the Great Depression and World War II. It's sobering to think that it might take a crisis of that magnitude for us to be recalled to who we are as a people, to a discussion about the common good. And hence brings us to the question really that's raised in the title of this event. Out of many, one. Really, it's a question. Is it possible? And the two speakers we have today, I think, will really help us understand how to start thinking about this, how to recall us to our unity. Let me introduce first, to my left, to your right, Amitai Etzioni. He's a university professor and professor of international relations at the George Washington University. He served as a senior advisor at the Carter White House and taught at Columbia University, Harvard University, and the University of California at Berkeley. A study by Richard Posner ranked him among the top 100 intellectuals. He is the author of numerous op-eds, and his voice is frequently heard in the media. He's the author of many books, including The Active Society, The Moral Dimension, The New Golden Rule, My Brother's Keeper, and most recently, Happiness is the Wrong Metric, which we'll get into. Professor Mark Lilla. Mark Lilla was born in Detroit, Michigan, and was educated at the University of Michigan and Harvard University. After holding professorships at New York University and the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, he joined Columbia University in 2007 as professor of the humanities. Mark is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, and publications worldwide. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. He lectures widely and has delivered the Wiseman Memorial Lecture in Israel and the Carlyle Lectures at Oxford University. In 2015, Overseas Press Club of America awarded him its prize for best commentary on international news in any medium. Okay, so let's start with you, Mark. You've written extensively on this fragmentation of our society today, and in your recent book, The Once and Future Liberal, I thought it was so interesting that you contend that this individualism that seems so pervasive is not just a function of the left versus the right, that while one could accuse perhaps libertarians or the Republican Party of being too individualistic, that you think this is actually something that has co-opted the party that you would think represents the common good, or did for much of the 20th century, the party of solidarity, the Democratic Party. So this is a cultural problem. Help us understand how we arrive at this point today.
Well, all cultural problems are problems in relation to a concrete material reality. So before you rush to culture, you need to begin and talk about the way we live now. And the story I tell begins after World War II and the affluence that arose in the United States and in Western Europe as well, and that brought with it in this country suburbanization, the liberation of women from a lot of drudge work around homes, children going to school, finishing school, and you had a new world out on the suburban frontier in the United States. And the move to the suburbs broke down communities that had been there before. So ethnic Catholic churches. I grew up in Detroit, and my paternal grandparents lived in a Polish neighborhood. My grandfather went to school with people who were still in the neighborhood. My father went to school with people who were still in the neighborhood and went to church and played on the church basketball team. Well, that disappeared when everyone moved to the suburbs, and suddenly you were in places where people didn't know each other, where the churches were not old brick buildings that had been there for quite a long time, but these new spaceship things that got built back beginning in the 1970s. And suddenly you're with people you don't know, different ethnicities, not that it mattered. Everyone with his, each family with its little plot, and people driving alone to work, and you were just in a more atomized situation. And what happened is that people started feeling a sense of atomization, and there began a kind of search for meaning in the 50s and 60s. Organizations like this one had their parallels in the United States. And so there was a search for something. And on the one hand, you had an atomized society. On the other hand, you had a kind of dissatisfaction with it. And how that worked out politically is we saw two waves or two forms or expressions, interpretations of the individualistic society we are, cultural interpretations of our material reality. One was the Reaganite one, which presented a picture that was very different from the one of the Roosevelt epoch, where men belonged to unions. There were thick connections in neighborhoods and in churches. And Ronald Reagan brought a different picture of a more libertarian America, where families were off on their own. Government was not the solution for common problems, it was the problem. There was an idealization of the individual entrepreneur rather than an idealization of a common effort by labor and business to create something. So we got a kind of right-wing economic individualism that grew up around the 80s. At the same time, there grew up on the left a kind of cultural individualism. So what went along with being a single elementary particle, economically speaking, was a new conception of the self, where we are also elementary particles, free to choose how we live, what our sexual lives are like, how we define ourselves, and all the rest. And so weirdly, even though, and this is in reference to your question, it looks like the individualism of the Reagan period on the right must have been in contradiction with what was going on the left. In fact, we got two expressions of our individualism. On the one hand, Republican libertarianism, and on the other, a kind of identity politics and an absorption with a politics of individual meaning.
Great, thank you. Amitai, you founded the Communitarian Network, and one of the main principles is that we're members of each other. You use a phrase I find really quite striking. You say, the me needs a we to be. You say that again, the me needs a we to be. That's a pretty remarkable statement, in this day and age, as Mark just described. I think the prevailing sort of theme, most people would say that individual freedom is paramount, and that everything that follows is some kind of imposition, sometimes necessary, but an imposition. And I think you suggested, gosh, we're just having the wrong conversation. Like, we've got to step back and really consider really all of what it means to be human, and not so narrowly define it. Help us understand that.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction and for this encounter. I thoroughly believe that if we have more meetings like this, we would solve some of the problems we already heard about, because these are the kind of situations we get together and we get to rebuild.
So you're coming back next year. Great.
Thank you, as part of the audience. So first of all, there's enough empirical evidence to convince anybody who is open to evidence that people don't flourish as individuals, but they flourish in relationships, in lasting, meaningful relationships. Just to give one quick reference, the study done in the high-rise buildings in Manhattan, in which many senior citizens live, and as they lose their capacity for mobility, they often stay the whole day alone at home, often they don't know even the people down the corridor. And when they were studied, they found a huge array, not only of physical, but psychological problems. On the flip side, people who are married or otherwise are in lasting, meaningful relationship live longer, healthier, happier lives. There's simply data. I'm not preaching, I'm just reporting the evidence. So, and there's no, it's not, I don't think anybody can contest it. Second, communities is where we make each other better than we would be otherwise. And that needs some explication. So economists had that theory, which is still out there, so some economists learn better. And it's a story each time, each year, still hundreds of thousands of students, is built on Adam Smith's maybe most famous quote, that the butcher doesn't sell you meat because he cares about you or cares about morality of the community. He wants to make money. And you don't buy beef because of any other person consideration. You want to have dinner. And so, as Jean Locke put it, these interests are naturally harmonious. So we don't have to worry about anything. Everybody will maximize their self-interest. The butcher will want to make money. The person who wants to cook dinner will cook dinner. And that's all we have to do. Tragically, that's not the way the world functions. If that would be the case, there would be no bullying, there would be no sexual harassment, there would be no crime. So we all are flawed human beings. And the question is, under what conditions are we better than we would be otherwise? One answer is policing. You hire a lot of police and you see to it, and that ends up in all the famous problems of corruption and overpowering and incarceration. The other is the idea to pay people. For a while, they want to pay people to read books, not to get pregnant and such. A much more humane and much more effective way when we have what's called informal social controls, in which when people do what's good, we appreciate it. And when we don't, we kind of gently call their attention to it. Now, may you think that's some kind of sociological fantasy. But let me ask you a question. What makes people not smoke in public? Now, I've been traveling a lot across this country. I have not seen yet a single occasion where somebody lights a cigarette in public or on an airplane or a train and such, and somebody says, "You're not going to stop," and call the police or the manager. At most, people say, "Hey," and that will do. People don't pick up after their dogs, not again because theoretically it's a fine, but it's so. Given what we do for our children, for instance, you have 8 of them. You know it's a big job. Largely prescribed not by law, not by economics, but because it's our moral obligation. What we do for our spouse is not, "I'll give you 30-day health care because when I get sick, you give me 30 days," a kind of exchange theory. It's because we have a moral obligation to each other, and we nurture it so informed. That's what our service to the community and our service to the country often is very much. So the second reason we need to think about people not as isolated animals, but as people who live in groups, is not only improves our medical and physical and psychological health, but it makes us better human beings. Next, we have a very powerful and important, I would say almost sacred, moral language of our rights. It's very much part of what we're proud of and should be. A right to free speech, our right to practice religion, so on and so on. We all know that language, and we're all the time on the guard that nobody will intrude in our rights. But it's a very, very partial moral language. It doesn't say a word of what our responsibilities are, what we owe each other. So let me, to save time, again, share with you a finding. When young Americans were asked some years back now, if when they are charged with a crime, do they have a right to ask to be tried by a jury of their peers rather than by a judge? Oh, they said, of course, that's one of our rights. And then when they were asked to serve in the jury, they said, well, I'm very busy, find somebody else. Now, if you just see the symbolism, this disjunction, On the one hand, people insisting, as they ought to, about their rights, but not willing to give what it takes to keep those. Because if your peers won't serve, there won't be a jury of your peers. And that is a much bigger picture here. Americans want more, if you ask them, they want more services, more housing, more education, free higher education, so on and so on. When you ask them to pay taxes, they say, somebody else should. This is the same disjunction as give me and I don't want to give anything back. And maybe most pernicious, Americans are very proud about when we went to Kosovo and stopped ethnic cleansing, when we went to Kuwait and rolled out Iraq. But when you ask the children to serve, they're very quick to point to somebody else. So a sufficient elementary moral language is to combine rights with responsibilities. One more sentence. Now, from what I call a liberal communitarian position, liberal rights, communitarian are obligations. Then there's a long and complicated conversation for another day. Then these two things come into conflict, because we clearly need to worry about rights and responsibilities. But we also have to be concerned when these two conflict, how we sort out which takes priority. And finally, I want to talk about the 60 million, we can argue about the number, of Americans we consider, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say we, some people consider red trash and rednecks, or most unfortunately call them deplorables. They are bigoted, they are prejudiced, but they are members of our community. And I think we should remember they are all redeemable, and I frankly prefer the language, they are all God's children. And therefore we should not approach them by dissing and dismissing them, but treating them as people we have to engage in a conversation. And when we do so, we'll find, by the way, that they have their prejudices, but we also have some very serious blind spots in our thinking. And to save time, just one quick example. Many of my liberal colleagues think that free trade is a holy grail. And anybody who questions free trade, that's like somebody who denies there's climate change. Just one step above a Holocaust denier. It's just ignorant. Well, there never was free trade. All we have is different levels of managed trade. If you start looking below the slogans, we don't allow people to buy drugs in other countries. We're very careful to examine if food comes from China because they have stuff which kill children. There are things we don't allow to sell and buy because of security reasons. NAFTA, which is the famous free trade agreement, is full of provisions of environmental protection. Mexican trucks cannot come into the United States because they're not safe. There is no free trade. There's just different degrees of managed trade. Why is that important? And to close here, once you acknowledge that, now we can have a conversation with people who feel that free trade is killing their livelihood and say, maybe we have to tweak trade. It was never pure. So, in short, we need to build community not by dismissing a large part of our fellow members of the community, but bringing them in.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please.
Amitai, it strikes me that you and I just spoke in somewhat different voices. I was speaking in a declarative voice, and you were speaking more in an imperative voice. That is, what we ought to do. But it seems to me that before we get to ought, we need to have a better understanding of where we are, not only socially, but also psychologically when it comes to community. And as you were talking, it struck me that there are at least three ways that one can think about where we are in our relation to our feelings about communal ties. One is that we say we don't want communal ties, and we simply want to have rights without obligations. We want to be able to flit off whenever we want without having a thick social life. But it's a mistake on our part because it's making us unhappy, though that's not the metric, let's say unhealthy, right? So one is that we don't know we have a problem, so we need people to be woke and for them to realize that there unhealthy, unhappy, and that requires a kind of enlightenment about it, and then perhaps they'll turn to community. Second one, possibility is that people are already ill, and they know they're unhappy like this. And so what's missing there is not convincing them that they need more ties, but rather providing the possibility for those ties either to redevelop, prevent ties that exist from dissolving, right? And so that would lead us in a very different language of imperative voice of what we ought to do. The third, and that came in relation to what you said about rights and obligations, is that no, the situation we're in is that we contradict ourselves. We say we want things from the common. We want there to be a jury of our peers, but we don't want to serve. So then the question is, so then the task would seem to be to make people realize that they're contradicting themselves, and if they want to have the things they say they want, they also have to have this other thing. And depending on which of those pictures, and there may be more, it seems to me that we start talking about what we need in a very different way.
Well, I very much agree with you. So I think we should allow our moderator to move on, because otherwise I was to say, repeat what you said. I very much agree that we need to take into account the three different situations you describe, and we'll have to hone differently our call for reinvigorating communities, depending on where we see.
But do you think people are not yearning for community, but they ought to? They are yearning for community, but they can't get it? Or is it that they want some of the things of community, but not the other things, the obligations that come with it?
In part, it's the individualism we describe in its two forms: the expressive psychological, where we encourage to let it all hang out, and again, it celebrates self in the end, and the other is the instrumental. You make more money than the other person. So in part, they've been sold an ideology of selfishness, and they bought it. So we need to show them that there are other belief systems. In part, and that's something we haven't gone into, some of them have very strong communities, but they're congealed along values which are antisocial. Because one of the mistakes of communitarians is to assume that a community necessarily is benign. A community is essential in terms because it provides social bonding, but a gang also provides social bonding. So the second dimension of community is the question: what is the content of the moral culture they share? And what we find in some of the parts of countries which are problematic for those of us who are progressive is not so much that they lack community, but they congealed along the wrong set of values.
Interesting.
Mark, maybe we could go a little bit deeper into your particular critique of identity politics as it is today. And there you talk about how we've become more narcissistic, right? There's just this incredible focus on the self that there isn't almost a possibility for people to think about, the common good or we as a people. And part of your response to that is we need to start dialoguing with people who are different than we are. And I read that, what you said, I thought that makes a lot of sense, but I'm curious as to where does that originate? Like, what needs to happen for me to see the other as good and worth engaging?
Well, yeah, that's a large question. I guess where I would start is to say that we need to distinguish between interest politics and identity politics. Now, interest group politics may congeal around certain identities that we share with other people. We share a common destiny, we share a common history, we share common adversaries, right? So you can have a kind of communal politics of African American identity, a communal politics of women, and a communal politics of gays and lesbians, where the idea is that we have a common problem, we participate in a common political program, which means we recognize there are other political ends that we want to meet. We're willing to make trade-offs because we have to make trade-offs. And so all of that can contribute in a positive way to a politics where we are engaging with each other because we recognize something larger than ourselves, beginning with the group that we belong to. But what developed beginning in the 80s and 90s was a different kind of identity politics that's focused on the very self, your inner self. The picture of the self is not that you're bound to other things, but there's a special homunculus within you, the you within you, the little man, right, or woman, who has various characteristics, whether they're sexual or ethnic or whatever, and those things can be very, very fluid. And so you're focused on yourself and how you think of yourself. And what you're seeking then in politics is two things. You're seeking meaning, because you're looking for whatever your politics are to be an expression somehow of what you are, rather than a position that could be right or wrong, but it's not you. The other is that you're looking for recognition. And that's a very powerful thing. I mean, Hegel's whole philosophy, his political philosophy, is based on the notion that human beings want recognition from each other. It's not something politics can provide, actually, you know? I mean, in society, we find ways of doing it, but democratic politics is not about that. It's about achieving common ends. So what happened from, I think, the 60s and 70s to the 80s and 90s is there was a shift from this group politics, this interest group politics around these identities, to a sense of looking for meaning. And one of the reasons, a sense of politics as an emanation of myself. So I think this helps explain what otherwise remains inexplicable, which is why college students today are unbelievably sensitive and find it difficult to engage with others in order to debate political things or listen to each other. If, for example, my position on, my position on interest rates has nothing to do with how I define myself as an individual. But if your only interest in politics is an emanation of your very self, and there's no gap between you and your opinions, anyone who questions your opinions is questioning your sense of yourself. And that's a very deep and shocking thing. And that is the way so many young people think of themselves and think of politics today. The range of their interest extends as far as their self-definitions and things affecting that. And they can't distance arguments from themselves. And when you can't even do that, can't distance an argument from yourself, you certainly can't engage with other people, right? And that just isolates you more.
Yeah, I like the way you described it, I think in the book, you know, I'm X, you're not X, therefore you have nothing to say to me. There's no conversation possible. Amitai, I want to get to your book that's coming out. It's a provocative title. I think most in this room would say that all that matters is our happiness, and that we ought to value then above else the free pursuit of our self-interest, at least towards happiness. You're suggesting we need to think a little differently. Help us understand.
Well, one good place to start is with a concept which you'll find in all the three major Abrahamic religions, and that is that we are flawed human beings, and that we know what's right, we know what's good, and we aspire to do, which often means serving others and the common good, our children, our family, our country, protecting the environment. But we have also a debased side, our urges which keep breaking through, and we are condemned to a life of struggle. And the question of what is a good life is a question under what conditions can we get closer to the values we are aspire to and committed to, and under what conditions are we failing more. Now, historically, most people accepted these religious prescription, and depending on each religion, they followed somewhat different courses, but they all tried to live up what was defined by their religion as a better life. It was certainly not just make me happy. Then secularism set in, and social science poo-pooed this idea. And they said, well, we have a much better explanation of what is the human nature and what's a good life. And again, the economists are the leading sinners here, where they start with this basically, so they don't use those words, with hedonistic materialism. The measure of how much you consumed, how much you bought, how much affluence you had, was what was assumed that the more goods you buy, the more services you buy, the happier you're going to be. So then when people start piling up data upon data to show that people are willing to sacrifice material goods for other purposes, they said, oh, well, then you do it for your prestige. So there's another form of happiness. You make yourself feel better. And then, by the way, this most recent thing, and that's certainly not Marx's invention, the notion that if it gives you meaning, that's good, disregarding what the substance of the meaning is. Disregarding that if I join a gang and kill a lot of people, it gives them a lot of meaning. And people who work for Daesh, for ISIS, they find a lot of meaning. So it's not a question simply of what makes you happy or what makes you meaning, it's what the moral content of these things are. Now, it's not surprising that the social science shy away from this question, because frankly, the next step is to ask what is moral and what is not, and that requires a moral judgment they professionally don't want to make. But I don't think you can answer the question, what is a good life, what is a life well lived, without asking what is a morally preferred position and what's a morally inferior position. Now, this reductionism, it's called, is really far-reaching. So there are studies done, for instance, of people who during World War II risked their lives to save Jews. You would think that's rather altruistic behavior. But no, the psychologists went and showed that really it was satisfying some mother complex you have. Anyhow, in all those studies, they succeed in somehow finding a way which in the end is self-serving. The economists ask a question, why would a soldier, when the hand grenade is throwing into their bunker, throw himself on the hand grenade so he will absorb the fragments and save his other colleagues? And they say, and I'm not making this up, that he calculated that if he would not have done that, he would be so embarrassing, he'd rather die than feel this embarrassment. I'm sorry, this is unadulterated bullshit. But the only reason we get that day in, day out is because we don't want to allow the category where people make sacrifices, major sacrifices, give up their happiness for something they believe in. People die for their country, not to get glory. How much glory do you have after you die? So just to drive that point home, let me just tell you about a personal experience I had. One of my colleagues a few years back had a very bad stroke. And the stroke left him so he not only could not speak, but he could not express himself. And he also had a hard time getting out of bed. And so his wife took care of him with some help. But as I occasionally visited, I saw she basically was wasting, because it is a tremendous, difficult thing to do. So I said, Gladys, why don't you go for the weekend and I'll take care of him for the weekend. And I tell you, it was one of the most difficult weekends I ever experienced. They were twice, I wanted to call and come back and I said, I can't do that. Spending 48 hours with somebody and helping them and talking to them and they cannot respond at all, I found very difficult. Now, was I happy after that weekend? That's an absurd notion. If by happiness you mean I had a great bottle of wine or I saw a terrific movie, I felt I lived up to my duty. And I think it's essential for good social science and for good moral analysis to distinguish when the sense we have when we live up to our obligations and the sense we have when we have fun and serve our own defined needs. No, I'm not talking about a life of altruism. I don't say people should never have fun. I don't think people should never be happy. In fact, that's one of the mistakes many of the counterculture and reform movements made. where they want to go to the opposite extreme of people denying everything else only to sacrifice themselves for service. That may also be a bridge too far, but I think it makes a difference if you leaven and combine your pursuit of your self-interest and happiness with service to others. A social worker, a nurse, a police person, they can do both. But if you try to become somebody who manipulates the stock market and you get happy in that way, it does not combine well with discharging your moral duties. And if you buy a drug which already has been developed and you increase the price by 5,000 times and laugh all the way to the bank, it may make you happy, but it will not serve the other part of you. So I think the conversation has to start by realizing there is an inherent tension between our aspiration to be good persons and to be happy. And we should not reduce those two categories because it makes for poor analysis and makes for a less good life.
Great, thank you. So Mark, look, I'm really curious to go to kind of the big question to me that comes out of this, which is how do we recover this sense of we as a people? And in your book, you go towards the idea that maybe we can start from our shared citizenship, as Americans. And my impression was from the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that even that was like it's a possible starting point. But you spoke almost in mystical terms about like what is it that galvanizes us, right? What is it that calls us back to this awareness of our dependence on others, that we are a people. We're not just a bunch of individuals. So what is it? What is it that recalls us to our unity? How does that happen?
Well, I think given where we are now, the thing that most immediately does it is crisis. It's in moments of crisis that something comes out of us, right? And so after 9/11, after a hurricane, after a flood, something like that, something comes out of us, right? And we discover, wow, there's been something growing inside, that we had forgotten about, and it comes out, and then it seems to disappear again. And so one picture you can give of us in our situation is, unless you have the moral equivalent of war all the time, you're not going to be able to induce people you're not going to be able to flip that switch because we've ceased raising people to do this naturally, right? And that's where, you can argue that that you can have a sense of community and shared obligation when it never occurs to people that there's a difference between their individual happiness and everyone else's happiness. So they aren't faced with this dramatic choice, do I jump on the hand grenade or not? Is it me or is it the others? It's just that's what one does. You're just brought up to think that's what one does, and you don't have to think about it too much. We don't live in that world anymore. And I think we have to be if we really want to address this, we have to be very realistic about the way we are now. I mean, you go into politics, you go into history with the country you have, not the country you might wish for. And the people you have, not the people you might wish for. And so we have to begin with a realistic portrait of ourselves. What are we like now? And the reason I talk about citizenship at the end of my book as a possible bond, that we can appeal to in politics is that it's a fact. It's not an aspiration. In fact, we are all citizens. And I think that you can begin building something morally and socially on a fact, only on a fact. And so you have to begin with something that's actually there in society, actually there in people's heads, and not simply dream that one day people are going to wake up and suddenly they're going to feel things for other people. You have to begin there, and maybe even begin with self-interest, if that's where people are right now. Self-interest properly understood, Tocqueville called it, that it's possible to help people interpret their own self-interest in such a way that they start helping with others. But If in fact we are all citizens, then we can start saying that we are going to share a destiny, whether we like it or not, because someone's going to be elected president, and that president is going to make certain decisions that will determine our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren. So we are all in this together. I'm not appealing to you, I'm telling you. We are all in this together. Given that, how do we work together? How do we develop a sense of an awareness about that so that people enter into their political lives with that awakened? Now, history has did the job for us in the 20th century in this country. This was, in fact, a pretty individualistic, it was certainly not a very civic country prior to the 1930s. Civic in the local sense, perhaps, but it was a frontier. People were going off on their own. But the combined effects of the Depression and the war made it clear to everyone that we're in this together as citizens. That either we're going to face economic disaster if we don't come together, and our way of life is threatened by fascism. And so that stimulated a sense of civic liberalism, for lack of a better term, that lasted us from the 30s into the 70s when it kind of petered out under the individualistic forces that I talked about. So I don't think we start addressing this problem simply by preaching about how nice it would be if we all started caring about each other and became more moral. If people aren't there, you're not going to catch them. And if you're serious about it, you have to begin where we are. And so that's why, just to end the thought, that I don't think we can really be serious about reestablishing some of these connections unless we're willing to be really honest and clear-headed with ourselves about what kind of human beings we have become.
So, I like this, where you start with, we have to start with what's the facts, that's in front of us, what's true. And that's a lot about what you talk about, Amitai, right? What is factual about us as human beings, perhaps culturally in the time, but also who we are, I would argue, from what you describe as through time. I mean, we are human beings. And so, for you too, the same question. How do we recover? And I'm particularly interested in your answer because you've lived through some pretty dramatic times. And as Mark just talked about, and as I mentioned earlier, I worry a little that we need a crisis, perhaps, kind of wake us up, to the fact that we do depend, that we have a common good. So, what do you think recalls us to a we?
Well, often when I go to meetings or sometimes even kind of informal gatherings, people ask me, "Oh, you're a sociologist. Explain to me drug addiction, or explain to me crime waves and such, or economic development." And I always have to say it's complicated because I don't believe that social science have one answer, which most people want to have a silver bullet. Yeah. And I really believe they often 4 or 5 causes are involved. I'm happy about this question because in this case I believe there is a single thing which can make a huge difference. And I call that moral dialogues. And what happened, I'm talking now first empirically, we tend to have conversations about redefining what is right and what our purpose ought to be. Now, it's very easy for us to conceive about such conversation on a dinner table or maybe in a town hall meeting, but it's very difficult for us to think about that 300 million people or a nation can have a moral dialogue unless you start thinking about what happened historically. And what happened again and again is somebody comes and raises an issue, Rachel Carlson Silent Spring, which triggered a billion-hour conversation, out of which came new shared moral commitments to the environment. I want to make this clear. In the 1950s, nobody felt anything morally about the environment. People were tossing things out of the windows of their cars or apartments or into the lakes, and they didn't think about it any more than most of us wake up in the morning and worry about Sanskrit or something like this. Now, even conservatives feel, I mean, after all, it's Nixon who created the Environmental Protection Agency and such. So there was a thesis. No, Rachel Carson didn't make it happen. She was the triggering event which led to this conversation. Now we can spend 6 hours asking why the ground was ripe, but that moral conversation led not only to a shared new moral obligation, but its translation into policies and laws. Betty Friedan wrote Feminine Mystique in 1963, started the feminist conversation, so on and so on. But let me not go that far. Let me talk about what's happening this week. We have a moral conversation about sexual harassment. And it's not going to be an idle conversation. It's not going to end up with, that's never going to happen again. But you come and look at it 2 years from now, and you see there have been changes in attitudes, changes in law, and changes in behavior, significant ones. One last example. Very recently, we had a conversation about gay marriages. Now, just to remind you how recent that is, it was President Clinton who signed the Family Defense Act, which defined marriage 20 years ago between a man and a woman. 11 years ago, when President Obama moved into the White House, he didn't want to talk about gay marriages. A few years later, the Roberts Court legalized gay marriages, and the public moved from a minority to a majority who supported because we had a moral conversation. Now, a moral conversation doesn't mean that everybody lines up. It's the nature of moral conversation that not everybody joins, but it was enough to change what is considered the proper culture and supported by attitude and by law. We need now a moral conversation about what kind of nation we want. And there I would like to add something. I very much agree to Mark's point about a citizen. But nation is not simply a bunch of citizens. A nation for me is defined as a community invested in a state. There are many states which are not communities. Afghanistan is a state but not a community. We have a nation, and most Americans feel some kind of moral involvement in their nation. Now, when the globalists come in this nation and make nationalism sound like some retarded position, they cut into the essence of the bond we still have. There can be bad and good nationalism, but to dismiss patriotism as standing in the way of progress is, first of all, sociologically mistaken. Patriotism is very much alive. It cut across all these groups, and therefore, in addition to building on citizenship, I think we have to build on the fact that most of us are still patriotic Americans, and we have to have a moral dialogue, what that means and where that takes us.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes left maybe for one last question, which is, again, I'll turn to you, Mark, but really the question is for both of you. You're both professors at universities. Mark, you've been critical of the universities in particular as not doing a great job of educating to this dialogue that you mentioned earlier, that promoting this conversation between people of different views. You referenced it earlier on. I'm curious, in your own experience as a professor at Columbia, as well, is that changing? What do you think needs to happen, and what are you doing, perhaps, to help facilitate that change?
Well, I'm very lucky at Columbia because I teach in the core curriculum, which means I get to teach great books, and I always teach in the fall term 18-year-olds because they still believe that a book can change their lives. By spring semester, if they don't have me, they don't believe that anymore. So the lucky ones come away with the sense that books can change their lives. And they also, I guess I can mainly just talk about what I do. You know, the ambient feeling is we are there to serve the students. And, but that's understood in, to me, a very peculiar way. So much of what students will be studying is so they can get what they want. I'm there to get them to think about what's worth wanting. And that means getting outside of yourself. It's not about anything reflecting your identity, but rather laying out possibilities for you to shape yourself in the future. That at that age, you're facing a great intellectual and spiritual adventure in your life if you choose to take it. And I find that if you get 18-year-olds and talk to them that way, they are thirsty for that. That's what they came to college for. But that's not the atmosphere there. There's a kind of cynicism. On the one hand, universities have become these ocean liners that are about so many other things. They're real estate firms. They train professionals in various ways. And the original notion of the university, and even more just the college as a small thing, is just kind of embedded there. You know, it's like you're trying to, pitch a tent on an ocean liner, and you're trying to have this smaller experience. On the one hand, and on the other, in the post-60s environment intellectually, there is a kind of cynicism, an air of suspicion about, certainly about higher things, but also about the notion that you actually can choose to become something. And that is an adventure. And so after you have a couple generations of professors who don't think that way, have never been taught that way, have not taught other people that way, students that way, the habit dies out, And so you can try to do what you can in the classroom. It's why, organizations, lay organizations like this, other religious organizations can feed that if students have that, right? Because that's the question I guess, just to finish, that I struggle with is the one I posed as, three possible understandings of ourselves at the beginning. Is there something in us that is just bursting to seek a meaningful life, connection with others, a thicker human relationship, and we're just being blocked by certain things that need to be removed? And when I sometimes teach my 18-year-olds, I feel, boy, this is easy. I just get out of their way, and they do it. And other times, though, you can get a picture where, no, they're lost, and that's no longer there. So I have my optimistic and pessimistic days.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Well, I'm sorry you asked it as the last question, because I don't have good news. I think universities, which used to be part of the solution, have become part of the problem. And we have, in major parts of universities now, this kind of identity politics driven to such extremes that dialogues have really become almost impossible. And the notion that people get attacked for their viewpoints, attack on free speech, that they are told that you cannot raise certain subjects because somebody may come apart. All these notions which basically are compartmentalizing us. In addition, is this notion, as somebody put it, and it's not my line, that people think we already arrived at 2050. The idea, some of at least the Democrats had, the demographic trends are naturally such they can forget about all the white people, and that from now on there's going to be, as we already quote have in California, we're going to have a majority of minorities, and so who has to be bothered, with working class people. All we have to do is each one line up our own identity, if it's gay or Latino or whatever. So that's exactly what we're then missing, is that common ground and the normative foundation. It say, yes, there is a room for diversity, and diversity does enrich us, but it has to be diversity within unity, and not diversity which eliminates unity. That concept, I don't find, has a taking on the campus. On the contrary, it's being attacked as a white construction in order to keep minorities down. Actually, a few weeks ago, there was an article in one of our major newspapers which said that civility was a white trick to keep black people from talking. And so these kind of lines are reflecting a much profounder issue, the notion that people are willing to push the identity differences to the nth degree. But it's particularly striking in the current political context, because if you are a progressive person, it doesn't matter if you're Latino or black or Asian or gay or transgender, there is this one tsunami which hits all of these people with enormous force, known as Donald Trump and his partners. So from a progressive viewpoint, you would think the first thing you want to do is worry about coalition building, getting together with everybody who is in any way willing to line up with you against this guy appointing more Supreme Court judges, passing more legislation. And the fact that people are willing instead to tell white people, shut your privilege and drive them out, is the sign why I think universities are part of the trouble and not part of the solution, and why we need you. That's why we need meetings which are not necessarily campus-based, which are community-based, so we find some place we can still have a civilized conversation.
Thank you. Before we thank our speakers tonight, I had the privilege of reading publications by both of these gentlemen and also listening to them, what they had to say tonight, along with all of you. And I took away a couple of things I just wanted to note that to me were quite striking. One thing I noticed really from both of you is that there's this challenge. It's really a challenge to me. It's, I think, a challenge to all of us. Amitai, I think your challenge that I took really was this idea that we, really to step back and look at the human being with all of the factors that make us human, right? That we've got to get out of this dialogue we have at the moment, which is reductive, happiness is the wrong metric, meaning matters, service, responsibilities, that are belonging, that are communal good, are things that are not just something that comes after we enshrine individual rights, but in fact something intrinsic to who we are. I think that's a really compelling challenge for all of us. And then from you, Mark, the challenge that I took was this idea to see the other as a good, this engagement with the other, dialogue with the other, whether it's in the universities or in the political sphere, whether it's for coalition building, as you described, but that the other is good. It's not just politics is not just an exercise in power. That in order to engage the other, I have to be convinced that it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile. And what particularly to me about that was interesting is that if I engage with the other, and the other is good, then it must be the case that I don't have a monopoly on truth, right? That I'm willing to converse with the other and through that discover what's true and good for me and society. The other thing real quick, and just to add, is the language that both of you use that to me is so striking is you talk about our unity as need. That it's not, as you were saying earlier, it's not just that we're all individuals and can't we all just get along, right? That's not the point. The point is that we have a need for unity that's intrinsic to who we are as human beings. So it's something we've got to start factoring in. Otherwise, we diminish ourselves as individuals, let alone as a society. Just a couple of quick announcements before you folks leave, and we thank our speakers. One is that right after this event, Professor Lilla is going to be signing his new book, The Once and Future Liberal. I've read the book. It's a terrific book. I highly recommend you purchase it and have the professor sign it. He'll be in the front of the auditorium from 7 to 7:30. And then also I would note that Professor Etzioni's new book, Happiness is the Wrong Metric, a liberal communitarian response to populism. It's available on ebook tomorrow. Today. So there you go. And then in hardcover or in publication by the end of this month. So please join me in thanking our speakers for joining us this evening.